Good day everyone, and welcome back to the channel, or to the channel if you're viewing for the first time. Now today I am starting my series where I'm going to go through all the different ships and all their variants and explain them in detail and analyze each individual ship as many other Lagrange YouTubers have done. But in true Dreadhawk fashion, I'm going to be doing it a little bit differently. I'm going to go through each variant and each ship individually and give them all their own detailed analysis and their own video rather than rolling all the variants into one. This is so that they can all have their own thing, because a lot of variants are completely different to other variants and function very differently within fleets and have different upgrades and stuff that you want to take. And B, because I don't have all the variants and not all in one place, so it's just easier on my half to just do them all individually as I get them or as I get to them. So today obviously we're starting with the Taurus Pulse Cannon Destroyer because I like the ship and it's where I want to start, and the community post said start with destroyers, so I'm going to start with the Taurus and I'll just do them in whichever order I feel like. Or if you guys mention in the comments or on Discord or whatever, whichever ships you would like to see next, I will prioritize those. But first thing I need to note, I haven't been able to make videos in the past few days, or past 2 weeks rather, because my iPad went kaput with hardware issues, and therefore I lost lots of my game accessibility, some of my Discord accessibility, and all of my editing software. So I'm looking at getting that replaced when I can. So for now we're running without editors and just using whatever I can to get some stuff out for you guys. So yeah, let's dive into it. We're going to give the ship a quick overview, have a look at it in a general sense, then we'll talk about it in a its defensive capabilities, and then we'll look at its offensive abilities, and then we'll see how we can actually put this into our fleets and utilize this to its maximum efficiency. And of course I will talk about all the associated upgrades and stuff with each section along the way, and there are timestamps if you want them. So if you're looking for any of that, stick around and let's dive into it. So the Taurus is a front row ship. As we can see, it is in the front row and it has emergency evasion to retreat to the middle row once it hits 10%. It's a destroyer with a base speed of 650, so it is on the slower end of destroyers. Destroyers tend to cap out at about 650 to 800. So yes, it is one of the slower destroyers in the game. However, it is faster than most cruisers and upper class ships, which tend to cap out at around 650 max and all the way down to 250. And that is of course without upgrades. Its DPS is quite high. It is known for being pretty high damage, and its tanking abilities are not bad either. Some people argue that its tanking isn't great, some people argue that it is. Ultimately, it does the job just fine. Whether it's an expert at it, there are other ships that are dedicated to tanking, but they also miss out on some of the advantages that the Taurus has, as we'll get into. So starting off with the Taurus in its defensive abilities. So the Taurus being front row, it's kind of got to have defensive abilities, otherwise it's just going to get deleted right away. It is going to get shot at first anyway. So if we look at the propulsion system, you'll notice that I have upgrades in the propulsion system. These are to increase the evasion by 16%. If you know much about, like tanking and stuff like that, then you will know that evasion is the optimal way to tank, and if you don't, now you know. And I do have a video on tanking, which I will put the link to on screen with a card thingamajiggy, or in the description rather. So yes, you can increase its evasion by 16%, which doesn't sound like much considering how many tech points it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you 16 tech points, but ultimately it is well worth the price. Yeah, so that extra evasion When on a destroyer, which is classed as a small ship, will save you from a lot of extra damage. It will dodge some of the incidental weapons, like the shots from all the little cannons and stuff that are scattered across pretty much every ship in the game, as well as help dodge out of some of those really high damage weapons that no amount of armor on a destroyer would be able to save you from. While we're on the topic of defenses, we can't really miss the armor system. It's like the main defensive system of pretty much every ship. So in here, we've got a base of 20 armor. We only have 2% energy resistance, and we've got a pretty decent pool of hit points with nearly 33,000. For a destroyer, that is a pretty nice pool. We can upgrade the armor by a total of 16 once again, which will bring us up to a 36 armor when maxed, which is not too bad at all. I'm pretty sure this costs 16 points as well. I don't think the last upgrade of each costs 3, but it might. I'm pretty sure it doesn't though. But yeah, so 36 armor, that isn't a lot of armor when we're considering front row ships and how much damage a weapon can do. But for a destroyer, when you take into account that it's classed as a small ship, large weapons on large platforms such as battlecruisers and stuff will have an innately hard time hitting it a lot of the time. This amount of armor is going to be pretty good as well, especially if you compare it to competitors and that extra evasion. So it does in total have a pretty good defensive profile. So as well as the hit point pool being pretty high for a destroyer is also handy as well, as always. If you're taking upgrades here, definitely take the 2 armor upgrades, the physical resistance, and then the extra hit points, because the more the merrier, and that will make your Taurus a pretty tanky front row destroyer. Of course, not the tankiest front row thing that you could use, but it does synergize nicely with having mid-row destroyers in your fleet. There's, just targeting will work in your favor a little bit more. And then they've also got pretty high damage, which we'll get into in just a second. But yeah, so that is what you would want to take when you're trying to increase the defensiveness of your front row destroyer. And in the grand scheme of things, while it might not seem like a lot, just looking at this, if you go look at like another ship, it is only going to cost you like the amount that a destroyer costs. It's not a massive investment, and you can have 10 of these. I'm not even a very high level, it's only going to take an hour and a half. Even like high levels, when you've got cruisers and stuff, they take upwards of 3 hours. Oh crap. Oopsies. They take upwards of 3 hours to build a cruiser. When your base is maxed out, it takes I think it's 45 minutes to an hour or so to build one of these, and the resource cost is a lot less. So the defensiveness that you're going to get when compared to other competitors is pretty good value for the price that you have to pay to build these things, and you can have 10 of them, which means that they're actually going to have to just take down more, which synergizes well with the evasion and other things that I've explained previously. Now talking about damage, I mentioned briefly just before, this thing can do a lot of damage. When maxed out, it can have a damage stat a little over 16,000, which is a lot of damage. So when we want to increase the damage of our Taurus to the maximum potential, I always go to the energy system first, because to max out the upgrade in the energy system costs less tech points. I think it's only 1 less tech point, but ultimately less tech points than the actual weapon system. So I max this out, increasing the cooldown and the damage by 15 and 10% respectively is a nice boost to get you started off. The energy system by itself will also increase your damage by 15%, which is already included in the actual stats of the weapons in the future, which we'll look at in just a sec. But yeah, so that is a good place to start. That is always where I start, because it is the cheapest. Now, if we go to the actual weapons, we have 2 types of weapon. We have 3 rapid fire pulse turrets and 1 experimental pulse turret. Sorry, my throat's getting a little bit dry. The rapid fire pulse turrets just your small like extra guns that tends to be on all the ships. 60 damage, anti-aircraft counterattack, fairly bog standard stuff, except they're energy weapons, which is pretty damn nice. They do work against aircraft. They do actually target aircraft that target the Taurus. Their anti-aircraft damage isn't, spectacular. It's not an anti-aircraft ship, but they will actively counter aircraft. So when combined with other anti-aircraft measures in your fleet, they will actually chip in and help you take out pesky aircraft a little bit quicker. But most of the damage comes from this experimental pulse turret, which has 500 damage base, which is bonkers. Well, I mean, you have to factor in the fact that you start off with an extra 15%, but effectively starting with 100 damage base. It penetrates energy shield. I'm not exactly sure how this works. I'm not sure if it like full on disables it like it says, or if it just bypasses X amount or whatever. Either way, it allows you to get a lot of extra damage through, and it is a unique ability which has another reason to take the Taurus. But this does only work against super capitals, so carriers, battle cruisers, auxiliary ships are super capitals. So when targeting big stuff, you might disable its shields and anti-aircraft counterattack, which also works. They're pulse weapons, which means their energy, very good against ships. Doesn't really change a lot against aircraft, except for the fact that they are pulse and not a different type of energy weapon, which means they have high hit rate, which is partially why the anti-aircraft properties on these weapons do function, because they can actually hit them, and they also help with dealing with evasion tanks, so Carillions and stuff, things at the front that want to dodge shots. These have a very high accuracy, so they're a little bit more effective against those targets. And then being energy resistance, they're just as effective against heavy targets with lots of armor, because they don't tend to have as big energy resistance. As for upgrades, I always take the cooldown first, because as we may see, the weapons have a very short cooldown already, and you might think, oh, let's take the damage then, but no, you just want these shots coming out as fast as possible because their profiles are already really good. They're high damage, you don't need to worry about armor, you're good to go. If you increase the damage and they've got good energy resistance, their energy resistance, because it's done by percentage, is going to scale the same as your damage, so it's not really worth taking first. I usually take the damage upgrade second, because damage, and the hit rate isn't vital on this ship because, as I mentioned, it's already got a good hit rate, so taking the extra damage is good. However, if you know that you are fighting things with good dodge chance, and you're like getting to these upgrades, you might want to take the extra hit rate first, just to make sure, because the extra damage, as I just mentioned, isn't particularly vital, nor is the hit rate. Just take whatever's best for your circumstance. If you're like leveling up and you're still fighting pirates and stuff, the extra damage will help you chew through those cruisers and stuff a little bit easier. But if you are fighting dodgy ships and stuff like that, then take the hit rate before you take the damage, so that you can get through those tanks and you'll deal with heavy armor just fine. You can take hit rate against fighters and corvettes, but I don't recommend it because you're not anti-aircraft ship. If you want the extra anti-aircraft effectiveness, by all means, I'm not going to stop you, but it's just generally the subpar option when really these things want to be chewing through the enemy line and just taking out those ships as fast as possible. You'll notice that I don't have the strategy here, and that's because this type of strategy I tend to find is a little bit subpar. It triggers like a massive damage boost for a very short amount of time, every once in a while, every minute and a half. Most battles are not going to be going for an extremely long time, so this strategy is only going to kick in maybe once or twice in most battles. Like, it's going to trigger twice in a 3-minute battle, and a lot of damage can be done in 3 minutes. It doesn't take a lot to have a 400 DPM ship, especially in PvP, and if you're unlucky and your opponent is very powerful, they can easily have over 1,000,000 DPM, so if you're going to engage them and you're going to try and get out as fast as possible, your strategy, that 15 tech points, is not going to do anything. it's just, yeah, it's just there. So I tend to put this into like the damage and hit rate upgrades, so that every moment you're in combat, you're getting maximum effectiveness, and you're not spending 15 tech points, which is quite a lot of tech points, on something that's going to trigger every once in a while. Also, the math pretty much evens out. Like, taking this doesn't really add a whole lot to your ship, except you get a small burst of damage. But as I just mentioned, generally the price of this strategy on ships like this with these kind of weapon profiles that have good cooldown and good damage and that kind of stuff, it's just not worth it. But you know, if you want to take it, by all means, but my suggestion is to leave that for now. So that is the defensive and offensive abilities of the Taurus. You've got good dodge, it's a small ship, so good dodge. You've got reasonable armor, a good hit point pool, and when maxed out, or even not maxed out, a lot of DPM. Like, you know, 6,000, just over 6,000 at base is quite a lot for a destroyer, on par with most others, but it scales incredibly quickly. So now, how do we put this into our fleet? How do we use this? As I've briefly mentioned, you probably want to be putting this in a destroyer fleet or frigate fleet, usually a mix or pure destroyers. It's not very often that you have all frigates and then just a destroyer frontline. So yeah, you want to be running destroyer frigates. With the Taurus, of course, you can run it in bigger fleets and it would do just fine, but you'll get the most synergy out of it with other things. You can run it as just a pure tank, just to absorb as much damage as possible if you're low on other options that are dedicated purely to tanking. But generally speaking, the Taurus is going to serve you best as an off tank. So an off tank being something that is high damage but can tank for your fleet, just not as good as, say, a dedicated tanking ship, or just pure DPM. I tend to use it as an off tank. I max out the evasion and then its damage, and then I'll go through its armor and finally its speed at the very end. And then this just allows me to, you know, get as much damage out as fast as possible, and I'll rarely stay in engagement long enough to lose many ships. So that is why I tend to not worry about the armor, because I'm only in there for a little bit to do some damage, or if I'm winning clearly, then I just stay because I am. But yes, if you're running with destroyers in your middle row, this will also retreat to your middle row, and the front row ships will help protect your middle row from things that might bypass the front row to target middle row destroyers. Having the Taurus there will help protect things like wing hussars, guardians, and stuff like that. And pairing this up with high damage things that do projectile damage is good for that extra roundedness in your fleet, you know, so that you're not all energy damage and you get stalled by energy, as well as pairing it with big alpha and stuff like that, alpha being, you know, things with a high damage characteristic, to help punch through all kinds of targets. But ultimately, the Taurus can carry its own. It does enough damage and it's got good enough survivability that if you put it with other things, particularly other destroyers, it is just going to fit in perfectly, because it doesn't really need a whole lot to function. It's not working with aircraft or anything specific like that. It's just going to sit in your front row, things are going to shoot at it, and it's going to shoot back usually a lot harder. Pairing it with healers is also not a bad idea, particularly if you're going to do multiple engagements. If one gets low and retreats to the middle row, hopefully your healers heal that one, pop it back up a bit, and it can go back into the front row and in the next engagement, and then it will retreat back as soon as it hits 10% HP again. But yeah, ultimately it doesn't really need a whole lot. You can pair it up with some other front row options like Carillions or Aldebaran or the Eris, the armored variant, and you're just going to get a very, very tanky battle line if you do that, just because yeah, they're all good off tanks essentially, and I'll cover them all when I get to them. But yeah, that's pretty much the Taurus, kind of just pick what you want it to do, assign your upgrades appropriately as you get the tech points, and just stick it in your fleet and pretty much just let it do its thing. If it dies, not too much of a deal, particularly in later games when your resources income is equivalent to many Tauruses. And yeah, you don't need to worry about upgrading at speed because, as I said, it's going to outrun most cruisers anyway. And so if they're running super caps and cruisers, you'll be able to have the edge of maneuverability over most of them, and you can still go in asteroids with it. You just can't go in radiation, but that's usually not too much of a problem. But yeah, I hope you found this useful, and I hope I didn't miss anything. It's a pretty straightforward ship, this one. So yeah, if you enjoyed, please consider liking, commenting, subscribing, all that kind of stuff. If you want me to cover a specific ship or variant next, let me know in the comments, and I will hopefully see you guys soon. Catch ya!